Okay, good morning everybody. You're all very welcome, and we're particularly delighted, those of us in the Bray Heads, to be joined this morning by people who've come through the Green Foundation of Ireland. So it's the Climate Action subgroup of the Bray Heads that has organised the talk, and as a group we're very anxious to work with others who are involved in climate action and biodiversity and environmental issues, because I think we can learn from each other and work together. So we're delighted that the Green Foundation is joining us. So our speaker this morning is Sinéad Mercier. We're absolutely delighted to have her with us this morning. She's an expert on climate change law and policy, with a particular focus on the concept of just transition and human rights. She's currently working with the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. Before that, she worked with NESC, the National Economic and Social Council, the Green Party, and also the Philippine Law Firm. Her new book, if you look at the bio on our webpage, has the intriguing title, Men Who Eat Ringfords. So I had to find out what that was about, and basically it's about the fact that we have so many important ringfords, that's archaeological remains all over the country, and unfortunately many of them being destroyed to make way for motorways and so on. So it sounds like a really interesting book. That's not what Sinead's going to be talking about this morning. She'll be talking about the concept of just transition to a zero carbon economy. I think most of us have come across the idea of just transition through the whole discussion about the Bord stopping the extraction of peat from the bogs and stopping the burning of peat in the peat generation power stations. I think the original idea behind just transition came from the climate justice concept, which Mary Robinson really promoted an awful lot internationally. So that was about the impact of climate change being disproportionate on the developing countries who didn't cause the problems. But I think more recently we've realised that this issue, because climate change affects us all, there's a just transition issue for us as well in Ireland, and not just in the developing countries. So anyway, that's enough from me. Over to Sinead to give her talk on entitled Building a Just Transition to a Zero Carbon Economy. Over to you, Sinead.
Thanks very much, Jane. That was a very lovely introduction. Thanks very much. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, so I'm just going to, thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here, and it sounds like a very interesting group, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A at the end as well, because I know the climate action subgroup, so it'd be great to hear what's happening at a local level. The local adaptation plans, the local climate action adaptation plans have been developed by government, so it'd be great to hear your perspectives on that. They're required to have a climate justice focus or to have regard to a climate justice focus. So hopefully you can feed into that. So I'm going to start with this focus, with this photo here. So just transition often tends to kind of be a more developed country focus. So climate justice, as Jane mentioned there, comes from the Mary Robinson Centre, promoted an awful lot, but it comes from developing countries' call for the need to understand that they will be worst affected by climate change while never really benefiting from the kind of high carbon economy that we have. Their countries are still quite poor and former colonies, an awful lot of debt still, and they will still suffer the worst effects of that kind of high fossil carbon economy. So this is a photo of the Maldives, and this was before the Copenhagen conference, which was, they were to develop the Paris Agreement there, which was kind of what we had in 2015, but this was back in 2010, and they signed a pledge underwater to tackle climate action, highlighting the fact that as a small island developing nation, they were going to be underwater very soon unless people took quicker action on climate. So while just transition tends to kind of focus more on Western countries, this is about a just transition that's also very fast paced. We need to look after people, and we need to move to a low carbon economy in keeping with human rights, but we need to do that as quickly as possible to provide justice globally. So what are the origins of just transition? I'm taking now as an assumption that you've heard a good bit about it, but it comes from a long line of work from trade unions working with environmentalist groups and health and safety experts as well. And they finally worked for a good couple of years, maybe 10 years or so, to ensure that the phrase just transition and human rights got into the Paris Agreement. So what the Paris Agreement is there's an overarching treaty at international level, the UN framework, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and that has protocols underneath it where countries agree to actually physically start cutting emissions. So the first one was the Kyoto Protocol. That was back in 2008, I think now. Tony Lowes is on the call, so he'll probably correct me. But and the Kyoto Protocol finished up recently enough, and the Paris Agreement was the kind of successor to it. And the Paris Agreement says that all countries have to cut their emissions to ensure that we keep below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius if we can. And in doing so, we have to ensure that we protect climate justice, and we also protect just transition, and human rights as well. And now those are in the preamble. They originally had their kind of own solid articles within the Paris Agreement, but it was relegated to the preamble, which is kind of a weaker legal requirement. But it was still a huge achievement. For the first time, just transition was actually referred to, and human rights, in an international environmental agreement, which is unheard of. No other environmental agreement internationally refers to human rights or just transition. And also as well, there are no human rights treaties actually that refer to a right to the environment. There are kind of regional treaties, but no international ones. So the Paris Agreement was a huge, big step. It was a very interesting kind of coalition building campaign between environmentalists and trade unionists, because often there's this kind of idea that it's jobs versus the environment, but that isn't true at all. And thankfully, these people worked very well together. So yeah, so that's the definition there, taking into account the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce, the creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with nationally defined development priorities. So if you are closing down coal plants, you ensure that people are redeployed and get decent work and quality jobs in new industries that are not climate damaging. But also the origins of just transition, it actually has a longer line. It comes a lot from Tony Mazzocchi. So he was the leader of the Oil, Chemicals and Atomic Workers Union, and he was a very fascinating man. I really recommend reading that book there. But he himself worked in kind of the nuclear industry. He worked in very, very damaging kind of circumstances that were very, very damaging in terms of health and safety of workers. And he said that, well, we want to be part of the peace movement as trade unionists. We want international solidarity and to protect people around the globe, but we also don't want to destroy jobs or destroy working class people. So he proposed that all ordinary workers in these nuclear power plants, whether they were for energy or whether they were for warfare, would be transferred into kind of what happened after World War II, that all the soldiers got free education. Now, unfortunately, there was a racism element there because it was all white soldiers. I think other African Americans didn't get the same benefits when they returned from World War II, which is something to keep in mind with this as well. But he did propose a super fund for dirt and workers. So that was that all these kind of nuclear power plants would close down and transition their workers into clean energy and very beneficial jobs for workers and for the environment. And it kind of comes from a long history, as I said, from environmentalists and trade union groups working together. So that other photo there is of Belgian miners going down into the pits. And we have the coal industry now is actually one of the best in terms of pay in Europe. And same with Bord na Mór as well, very high quality pay, very high quality conditions. But this didn't come by accident. It came from years and years of very hard trade union organizing and workers organizing and scientists working with them to highlight black lung disease or other diseases that they were getting. So it's important to keep that in mind, that our paying conditions today, our weekends and so on, we only have them because of this hard slog that others have gone through. So just giving you examples, a lot of the Green New Deal kind of discourse that's now started up. So the Green New Deal is this idea that you can transition a whole society from a kind of high carbon one into a low carbon one while looking after people. And they often hark back to Roosevelt's kind of New Deal campaign back during the Great Depression. So an awful lot of people were given jobs in the natural parks. They were given jobs in art as well. So this is a lovely photo from Norman Rockwell. And it was part of kind of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the kind of campaign to envision a new society, a better society that would look after everyone. So today we have the Green New Deal proposed by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the US. There's also Green New Deal campaigns in other parts of the world as well. So here you can see some of the nice posters harking back to that time. But this idea is getting more and more traction, that we don't have to have a jobs versus the environment scenario, that we can look after everybody, and it's not about getting less and less while the environment gets better. It's about creating a better world for all. However, trade union organising and workers' rights are very much key and part of this, because there's growing evidence that it's not actually about individuals damaging the environment. There's growing evidence that actually affluence, or very, very affluent populations, now that's not people even who are on €100,000 a year, and this is kind of people who would have enough resources to be able to avoid paying taxation anywhere, the kind of extreme wealth, 1% kind of wealth. And that is actually linked more and more by Thomas Piketty and others to high carbon lifestyles, and to a greater amount of damage from climate change as well, because that tax avoided wealth is invested into high carbon activities. So this kind of Green New Deal campaign is about ordinary people getting a piece of the pie, I suppose, but that pie is good for everybody. And the European Green Deal has taken inspiration again from America and from that kind of Green New Deal, which was very popular. But it's also harking back, I'm sure there's people on this call that would remember the Green New Deal campaign in Northern Ireland a few years ago. So this idea has been around for a long time, but it's now kind of getting very good traction. So the European Green Deal, Ireland has to implement this under the governance regulation. So what the EU governance regulation is how the Paris Agreement, the international agreement, is kind of divided out amongst all the countries of the European Union. And the governance regulation requires Ireland to cut its emissions. Well, we haven't decided how much we have to cut our emissions just yet, but as a whole, Europe has to cut its emissions by 50 to 55%. Its fair share is actually 65% of current emissions. But under this governance regulation, Ireland will have to cut its emissions by a certain amount. And it will also have to prepare a national energy and climate plan. And under that, there'll be a territorial just transition plan. So sorry for all these all these phrases, it's a very complex area. But the territorial just transition plan basically is that the Midlands have to phase out their coal and peat plants in Ireland. And we have to prepare a territorial just transition plan in line with human rights, the social pillar of European rights. And we have to develop a plan for that area that no one is left behind. Now, at the Q&A, I'll describe this a bit more if you like, because I'll just move on. But still, again, just transition is again older. And it actually comes from developing countries again. Developing countries have been to the fore on climate change in general, always highlighting it in a very kind of human-focused, climate justice-focused approach. And again, just transition comes from the call of developing countries and countries that were very reliant on exporting their fossil fuels to other countries. So Mexico, for example, had an awful lot of oil, an awful lot of fossil fuels, but they had to export that to developed countries who could benefit from it better. So all the jobs and all the wealth was in developed countries, which took these resources from poorer ones. And many of these countries kind of started to realize in the developing world that this wasn't a very kind of sustainable option for them, that if they wanted to develop, they would have to move past relying on being kind of this very resource intensive nation. However, unfortunately, they called for a just transition, from fossil fuels because of their damage, and from nuclear energy as well, into a new age of man's history, an age of man's history that was reliant on the sun and the wind. So it's a very interesting speech. I would recommend looking it up, because it was back in 1979, before kind of climate change language became part of the course. And yet these countries who were reliant on fossil fuels, who were dependent on them, wanted to move off them as soon as possible. So again, harking back to that kind of socio-economic focus, nobody really wants to rely on fossil fuels. What they want to rely on are good quality jobs. People don't mind what they are. However, the 1973 oil crisis hit, and a lot of the kind of foreign debts that these countries had, such as Mexico, threw them further into debt. They couldn't, the price of oil collapsed. They couldn't actually, the whole regime, that kind of very export dependent, resource intensive way of economic development collapsed. And what happened was that the IMF moved in, and a lot of developed countries to get there after the defaulting on debts, and they started privatizing and liberalizing energy systems. So the first country that actually was liberalized and privatized, had its energy system liberalized and privatized, was Chile under the Pinochet dictatorship. And then it followed all across the world. So a lot of Europe as well, their energy system was privatized and liberalized in the 90s. In Ireland, we had a similar part privatization under the ESB in 1990. So in this context, we have to understand, and with that privatization, there was a huge drop in jobs. So about 90% of employment in many countries around the world, which is what I'll discuss in these case studies. A lot of the employment in particular regions, which were again resource dependent or dependent on one form of fossil fuels, they lost an awful lot of their work with privatization and liberalization. So that's important to kind of keep in the background when thinking about this, that energy is a right and a public good. It's not just a commodity for wealthy and powerful countries. It's not just a commodity in general. We all have a right to access energy that is clean and that benefits the planet. So that's, and we can see this today still. Actually 11% of Europeans are in energy poverty at the moment. And this is a big issue in Ireland in particular. We actually have one of the highest rates of energy poverty in the European Union, ourselves and parts of Scotland. And this kind of is a growing issue. It's getting worse and worse, as there are a variety of different issues with this. It comes in, not so much in Ireland, but certainly in other countries. The privatization of energy didn't actually make energy cheaper. It actually made it kind of more expensive. You also have issues with upgrading grids, which is beneficial from a renewable energy point of view, but the infrastructural costs are put as a flat charge on everybody's energy bill, and that goes for gas infrastructure as well. So gas is considered a less carbon intensive fuel. That's since been debunked. But a lot of countries have invested in electricity upgrades and gas grid upgrades to kind of take climate action. But how that is done is through kind of flat charges on everyone's bill, which has increased energy poverty, along with many other factors. Also, low quality housing in Ireland is a particularly bad issue, a lot of rental housing in particular. So this kind of right to energy is a very interesting new area. It's very new. A lot of developing countries have been campaigning on this again for many years, such as in Africa in particular, South Africa as well. Access to energy there is again kind of racially segregated. So people don't have access to internet or electricity in kind of more black neighborhoods. And that kind of has implications for civil and political rights, not being able to take part fully in your community because you can't have access to the internet, and also kind of heating your home and so on. It's a very interesting area. So Ireland has kind of, there's discussion of it here. I'm sure you're well aware yourselves of kind of energy poverty discussions. A lot of them started when the Green Party were last in government, and they introduced a carbon tax, but alongside a commitment to increase kind of energy poverty measures. So a few reports were done, but they were never actually implemented in subsequent governments. the retrofitting schemes, so kind of doing up housing, making sure it's quality housing, existing housing, didn't really take place. It's kind of very ad hoc kind of approach to it. So we have a growing issue with energy poverty. The Vincent de Paul are particularly good on this issue. Also as well, Irish Rural Link are brilliant. I really recommend reading some of their things. And the Traveller Mortgaging and Budgeting Service. So this was something I was quite shocked. How energy poverty tends to, now this is kind of a side approach to just transition. So there's the approach of just transition, which is very focused on workers' rights and protecting workers, which is very important and is kind of the main driving force of it. But then you kind of have a climate justice, just transition approach, which is that you don't leave anyone behind, that you ensure that the most vulnerable in society are always to the fore. Again, very similar to the Sustainable Development Goals. If you focus on the concerns of the most vulnerable and have them first placed in your thinking or your action on climate, you can't really go wrong. You won't end up with maladaptation, which is when a decision on climate change, a policy, actually ends up worsening climate change and also worsening poverty. This kind of secondary just transition climate justice sort of approach is very much what Irish Rural Link or Vincent de Paul, Traveller Mortgaging Advice and Budgeting Services are looking at. So I was quite shocked to learn that travellers in particular are in severe energy poverty. And again, this is kind of due to lack of data. We don't actually fully know who is energy poor, why they're energy poor, where are they? And travellers kind of end up in this kind of very crisscross kind of issue where 77% of travellers that are in halting sites are in energy poverty. And that is because the caravans that they are in are not energy efficient. They're generally very cheap and not very warm at all. And they also have to run all their electricity off a generator. And that generator means that it's too expensive to have a fridge. So they are then food poor because they have to buy food every day. And you also have an issue with the fuel allowance in that you have 2 or 3 households on the one fuel allowance or in the one kind of spot on a halting site. And that then leads to, if you're spending 108 a week on energy and the fuel allowance just doesn't cover that really amongst 3 families. So there's a whole range of kind of intersecting difficulties there that I really, it'd be great to see more research on that and more of a study. Now, Jane, can I just ask that you let me know if I'm going over time or anything?
You're fine. You're
fine.
Okay. No problem.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. So now I'm just going to talk about the case studies. So of just transition. So I'm in the Q&A. We might discuss Ireland a bit more, but I just thought that I'd give an overview of what's happening in other countries because it's not really part of the debate as much. So I worked with the National Economic and Social Council exploring 4 case studies of kind of just transition or where communities I took it as communities that were heavily reliant on a single kind of resource or single type of development kind of, and they were often communities, which is the history of kind of energy generally, which is interesting. A lot of communities were encouraged to come to very remote areas. So the Midlands is an example, kind of where there was a coal mine, where there was a lot of peatland, where there was kind of, and these communities then didn't really have access to other types of employment. Everything was kind of built around the energy system and kind of associated jobs, associated schools and so on around it. So these kind of communities do, they have legitimate expectation from the government in that they were encouraged by government through state-owned energy companies to set up in these particular areas. So they do deserve to be justly transitioned, besides kind of the moral argument as well that you would have in general for these kind of communities. So I looked at Germany, Australia and Scotland. And the reason why the National Economic and Social Council was looking at these was because the Climate Action Plan, so that was Richard Bruton's Climate Action Plan in 2019, it asked that government take further action on just transition, which was very good actually. And it called on the National Economic and Social Council to do a study of how digital and climate transitions would affect the workforce. So I was looking at case studies in order to inform that approach. So I looked at Germany, the Ruhr, and Lautz, which is East Germany. I looked at Latrobe Valley, which is a smaller community as well, more similar maybe to the Midlands. And I looked at Scotland as well, which is a very interesting example of a whole economy just transition approach. So they're not just looking at phasing out a particular region, they're looking at how Scotland itself as a whole can move off coal and all fossil fuels and gas as well, which is very interesting because they're heavily reliant on oil and gas in the North Sea. So it's a good example if you want to know more. And we took the International Labour Organization and their foundational principles. So again, they were driving force behind the Paris Agreement. And I won't list all the principles there, but basically it's around including the voices of affected workers and trade unions, and including the workers' rights element of it as well. So first, I'll look at Western Germany. So I won't try and pronounce this, but basically local people say it was no pony farm, so it was not an easy transition for them. It took 60 years to transition the Ruhr. With Ruhr Valley was heavily dependent on coal and steel, and heavily dependent on that kind of heavy industrial development. And it also led to huge pollution in the area. So the river that runs through the valley was one of the most polluted in Europe. But it didn't have very high quality jobs in the beginning, but after years of organizing, it did. But however, in the 1960s, the area, because of the phase out of coal subsidies, and also because cheaper imports were coming in from other countries around the world with increasing free trade, the region did have to kind of look at itself and go, okay, we have to start moving off this into something new. And that was very difficult for them because they actually had very high quality jobs and employment. And they knew that they probably weren't going to be able to attract foreign businesses into the region. They were going to have to upskill themselves and find out, well, what are our regional skills? What are our good points? How can we sell ourselves as a region? And that led to a very interesting look at kind of skills audits. They built the first university. There wasn't a university in the region because Bismarck feared that if the working class educated themselves, they would take over, which is interesting. But it was a very difficult transition for them. So it took, as I said, 60 years, but they finally did close it in December 2018. And it was actually a very peaceful transition. And what I found from it was that they moved into a lot of kind of sunrise technology. So Siemens, for example, a lot of technology, a lot of renewable technology, and a very small focus on tourism, but more tourism for the area, kind of benefiting people's health, because a lot of them had suffered for many years with coal and pollution. But it was, and also very kind of, they built museums. They kind of took very kind of cultural regeneration of the area. They transformed a lot of the old coal mines into, which are now UNESCO certified museums. But a lot of it, and very kind of high quality academic jobs as well. And they also took a lot of their knowledge from the pollution in the area and stopping pollution. They used that to transfer into kind of very highly skilled environmental law kind of work, or environmental ecology specialists as well. So it's a very good example of kind of trusting local people or trusting workers, not kind of considering them a resource that's been used up and done with and to be discarded, but kind of saying, okay, let's audit the kind of skills that are here that have been built up that don't actually have a university kind of certification, but have an awful lot of knowledge that's built. And let's kind of try and build something from that instead of kind of a foreign direct investment approach, which is what was followed in Wales after the closure of the mines, and they ended up with call centres, unfortunately. But just a few of the principles that I found in Germany was that there was a constant and ongoing social dialogue. So constant coal run days. So these were coal roundtables in 1987, 1993, 2007, but also there was constant engagement by trade unions, industry, and the state at federal and state level in Germany to negotiate the closure of all these mines. I mean, this is a huge area, heavily reliant, long cultural history of the Ruhr in Germany itself, about building Germany as a nation state. There's other issues there, but it's a very kind of proud history from a working class perspective and from a regional perspective alone. And that was a very difficult transition for them, but they managed to do it quite well. And they did it through dialogue, consistent engagement, heavy public investment, so huge investment from the government into the area, but also allowing the area itself to direct where that investment would go, which was quite innovative. So rather than kind of the government controlling them from a top-down way and saying it has to go here, we say what you do, the local authorities in the area were very strong, and they built kind of the idea, for example, for the museum, a lot of kind of like technological development and so on. Very, very interesting. So it's a good example. Now, there are still issues which we'll follow on to here. So there are still issues with coal in Germany. So Germany is one of the kind of, Germany still has an awful lot of coal, but it's lignite. So lignite is kind of brown coal. It's a softer coal, not quite peat, but kind of in between peat and hard coal. And they also import a lot of coal from other countries, such as Colombia. Now in Ireland, we know about the ESB was importing coal from the Cerrejón coal mine, which was involved in lots of human rights abuses, the movement of indigenous people off their land for the coal mine. And Germany still imports coal from areas such as that, from developing countries. So again, there's kind of like an international focus to this just transition as well. It's not just about Germany investing in the Ruhr or investing in these kind of Western areas. It's also about ensuring that other countries in other parts of the world that we import coal from are still looked after too. However, so Germany they phased out hard coal mining in the country in 2018. And in 2016, they had decided that they were going to phase out everything, so all reliance on coal, which was a very, very difficult thing to do. We don't really hear much about how Germany is so reliant on coal. We hear a lot about their Energiewende, which was their very huge community ownership of wind approach, which is very, very good. However, the phase out of coal was actually very difficult, and how they decided to do it was in 2018, they set up a commission on growth, structure, change and employment, basically called the Coal Exit Commission. And again, with this very strong social dialogue approach, they brought together 31 members of all the stakeholders that would be kind of harmed by this, but also benefit from it. So young people, environmental groups, alongside unions and local government and locally affected people. And they decided after many months of negotiations, they decided to end generation by 2038 or 2035. Now that's not actually in line with a Paris Agreement approach, but we'll leave that aside for now. It still was a huge achievement for them. And what they did with this was that the German government, in order to build trust in the region, so Lusatia, which was in East Germany, that was going to be worst affected by the phase out of brown coal. They unfortunately, do I have a slide here? Yes, so they, again, when the Berlin Wall fell and when the energy system was kind of amalgamated into West Germany, they had a 90% drop in employment. So, and that was huge for the area because again, as I said, very rural, not many other kind of jobs in the area, and a 90% drop in just 10 years. Even overnight, some people just lost their jobs. And that pain or that feeling of just being kind of left behind or being discarded is still there. It's still very live. And you also have a very difficult scenario because you have a lot of towns, so beautiful towns in the region that actually have been raised for mining. So how mining is done, lignite coal, is through basically open cast mining, so cutting huge swathes of land. So full towns and villages were actually destroyed for these mines. So you have this kind of very difficult scenario where people rely on it for jobs, but they also lose their homeland. So what the government did in order to kind of allow this phase out of the region was that they said, right, well, the first thing they did was pass legislation to invest 40 billion in alternatives in the region. And that was very important for trust. And kind of a lot of this actually was kind of the Coal Exit Commission is actually a second kind of reunification investment. So the fall of the Berlin Wall, the unification program there, the huge investment that was done, a lot of it was very good, but some of it kind of fell through the cracks. And this is kind of a way to kind of fill those cracks again. So a second kind of Berlin Wall investment strategy. And it seems to be going quite well, generally, but there's still issues to be ironed out, but it's in process. So, but again, very interesting region. And this here, so this was Victoria in Australia, the Latrobe Valley. This was kind of a much smaller place, so around maybe a couple of 1,000 jobs or so. Sorry, less than that. It's maybe around 500 jobs between a timber mill and coal plants in the region. So this was kind of a small area in Victoria in Australia, and the Latrobe Valley, their coal mine and coal plants, they all serve Melbourne, so this huge kind of very big kind of very liberal values sort of city. And it's again a very interesting example of kind of the different kind of cultural contexts that are in play, because again, they produce 85% of Victoria as a region's electricity, for Melbourne as well. But when it was privatized again in the 1980s, again, there was a huge drop in employment. And because it was a rural area that really didn't have much other jobs at the time, there now is a good amount of healthcare work, other types of jobs in the region. But in the 1980s, there wasn't really, and people expected privatization to result in more jobs. So people actually went out when they heard privatization was happening. Coal workers bought new cars, they kind of did up the house, and suddenly they lost all their jobs. And it caused a huge kind of cultural rift and kind of sense of loss. And you hear that a lot with the Midlands as well. These jobs aren't just kind of, it's tied up with a whole cultural strength and way of life and a way of understanding, and you know, like sons and fathers and grandfathers, and suddenly it's gone, and it's as if it's never existed. And not only that, but now you have an added kind of layer of climate change where you're expected to feel guilt for 3 generations of working in a coal mine. So that kind of sense of identity is very important and very delicate. And what happened in Australia, unfortunately, was that in 2007, the Gillard government, the federal government, decided to take more action under the Kyoto Protocol, the precursor to the Paris Agreement, and they decided to introduce an emissions trading scheme and help coal mines to close, and carbon pricing as well. So a carbon tax, along with a contract to close coal mines, and an emissions trading scheme as well. Now, this was accompanied by 5 billion to coal companies to close down. So they will get 5 billion in compensation, and the communities and workers that worked in those coal mines were to get barely anything, very, very little. And it was also spread out over the whole region, which parts of are quite wealthy, while the kind of more directly affected coal mining community were not going to get anything really, if you spread it out. So what happened was, obviously everyone got very angry and there was a huge pushback against Greens and green kind of thinking. So like, here's a few examples here: God hates Greenies, kind of real anger against what was happening, that this kind of environmentalist proposal was being brought in without any structural adjustment. The coal companies were getting a huge payout, but they weren't. And this kind of continued for a number of years. And then in 2014, there was a huge 45-day fire in the coal mine, because again, it was privatized, and that privatization had led to kind of lax health and safety standards. Kind of the international company that owned it, Engie, was a French multinational. It didn't really have as much kind of stakeholder engagement or kind of roots in the area. So a 45-day fire happened. It caused huge air pollution, huge damage. There's a photo there in the bottom right-hand corner. It looks like something from Lord of the Rings. And then after that 45-day fire, the international company decided to close Hazelwood Power Station with only 5 months notice, so 750 jobs. So kind of a lot of tension, a lot of kind of anger. And thankfully what happened was that the Victorian state government moved in. It was the Labour Party at the time, and they listened to what had been years of campaigning by communities, trade unions and local businesses. They had all prepared this kind of plan for La Trobe Valley. So it's a really nice example of how communities, even though there wasn't state leadership like in Germany, there wasn't engagement from the beginning from government, these local people came together to build a plan for the region and backed it up with citizen science. They backed it up with kind of workers' rights proposals. They worked together as a group to propose new ideas for the region. And because of that local preparation, the Victorian state government just came in with 266 million and backed that local plan and started investing in the La Trobe Valley Authority, which is kind of this local regional development agency. And it's going quite well, I think. Now, there are still some gaps. I think that the politics in Australia seems very divided. The Conservative government don't seem to be kind of as helpful, now this is from interviews, as perhaps the Labour Party, which is in Victoria is, but it seems to be going well. It's just going to take an awful long time, and that's something to kind of keep in mind. These transitions take so long and they require an awful lot of trust building, and what is trust as well. What I'm finding from the research is that it's about humility. It's kind of going in as not as a climate activist, but someone that's there to help human beings, or to be idealistic about it, and listening to their concerns. And in that kind of Aarhus Convention approach, if you protect the concerns of those who rely on the environment or rely on the world around it, you can't really go wrong from a climate justice point of view. So, for example, these people, while they were heavily reliant on the jobs in the coal mine, they were also suffering hugely from air pollution damage and fire as well. And the coal mine in some parts was a mere kind of couple of meters away from buildings. And again, this kind of idea that environmentalism can be separated out from justice perspectives or from human rights perspectives. This is a few phrases here from the local community. They were terrified of the kind of green proposals to shut down the coal plants, because they just felt that it was a reinvigoration of the trauma that they'd already suffered after privatization. And they felt they weren't being spoken to, that they were being spoken down to. There was no plans to transition the workers into new renewable industries if they were going to be there at all. Now, thankfully, the Labour government negotiated that the current coal plants, there were maybe one or two others that are still going, and they negotiated that they would be transferred, the Hazelwood workers would be transferred into those existing coal plants. So it's not actually a just green transition, but it kind of, it allows for debate to kind of happen in the meantime and for a new proposal in the meantime. And I think renewable initiatives are starting. But so Scotland again is a very interesting example. It's actually considered a climate leader globally. They benefit from the UK's Climate Act, which is kind of widely considered to be a very good climate act. It's resulted in cuts to emissions quite quickly because they have a very strong carbon budget kind of approach. Now, some of the people I spoke to said that the shutdown of manufacturing in the coal plants and the replacement with gas actually led to a lot of that drop in climate emissions. But still, they do actually have an awful lot of wind and a lot of community-owned wind as well. Though again, community ownership has to be defined on a right to energy approach, I'm finding, because community-owned might just mean wealthy people in the community. So Orkney Islands off the coast of Scotland has the highest amount of community-owned energy in Europe. but it also has so much energy that they're producing hydrogen for the local buses. But they also have the second highest rate of energy poverty in Scotland. So it's kind of those local people who don't have the resources to invest, they should get free energy or something like that, some sort of approach, so that it's not just wealthy people getting paid from the grid. But there's a lot that's good about Scotland. Certainly when I was there giving a presentation, I was quite embarrassed about how little we've come. But they have a very interesting scenario where they have this kind of high amount of wind and high amount of renewable energy, but they also have a huge North Sea oil and gas kind of industry as well, which brings huge wealth into Aberdeen in Scotland. So the Just Transition Commission is a really great example of where they decided, okay, well, we have this dichotomy going on, and we are good on climate and energy. They have a huge kind of academic kind of industry built around as well, and a lot of kind of other industries related to that. But how do we ensure that kind of, we don't just do the two? How can we move off oil and gas? So they brought together 30 members with expertise in a 2-year time frame. They just published their report recently. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to read it before today, but I read the interim report and it was quite good. So they took a very kind of place-based approach. So very, not in the same way as the Ruhr, which is where local government really got stuck in, and same in Australia, where the local kind of Labour government really just rolled up their sleeves and got very involved in ensuring that in kind of workers' rights issues. So in Scotland and in Australia, the local trade unions, the government and the businesses kind of all sat down together and hashed out kind of redundancies, hashed out redeployment, hashed out new jobs. Now in Scotland, they're kind of taking a couple of steps back, and they're looking at it overall as a country. What are they going to do into the future? And it's kind of, while it isn't while it isn't kind of requiring the quick phase out of oil and gas industry that you'd like, it is allowing kind of language that couldn't really find a home to start being discussed. And we're finding that in Ireland as well, with the phrase just transition. It's kind of opening up forums and opening up discussions which allow human rights into the fora, allow social justice, jobs to be discussed alongside biodiversity, alongside climate action. And I think that comes from, I discussed this in my book, but that comes from the history of climate law and environmental law being very tied to cost-benefit analysis, very tied to market kind of approach, that if we put a price on nature and enter it into the market, then everything will kind of work itself out okay. And it's very difficult to talk about human rights in a market context, because it's something that you could never put a price on. Now that's a separate discussion that we might discuss in the Q&A, but basically Scotland kind of opened up a forum where you could discuss everything, which was great. So you have this kind of conflict between Aberdeen, which got discussed in the Just Transition Commission, where you have the highest wages in Scotland and the highest wages apart from London, really, in the UK as a whole. Huge, very good paying conditions, very kind of like very associated jobs as well, kind of lots of universities are involved as well in oil and gas. And since 2014, there's been a huge downturn in jobs, and also the fields themselves, the oil and gas is running out. And what's the community know that this is happening, and they have said, like, I spoke to the oil and gas industry and they said, look, we're very happy to work in any industry. We're brilliant at energy, we have the skills, we don't care if it's renewables or not. But the problem is that we don't feel that the government is kind of committed to that long-term approach in moving away from oil and gas. We feel that we have to stick to this for now because there's no transition happening. So the government, for example, actually it was, if I can say, it was a little bit sneaky. They highlighted this kind of transition skills development fund, but it wasn't, it was it wasn't to transition workers into renewables from oil and gas. It was to keep their skills in oil and gas going during the downturn, so that when the field started operating again at a high level, you still would have workers there. And because it was called transition, people thought that it was away from fossil fuels, but it wasn't. So besides that, hopefully now the Just Transition Commission itself will propose further actually transferable resources, and because the Skills Development Scotland, for example, that's kind of similar to, they did an awful lot of studies on the oil and gas industry and how transferable the skills are to renewables, renewable energy. And they have a huge number of reports. I think there's 14 reports done by Skills Development Scotland and associated government bodies, but they weren't acted on by government. So this is again similar to Germany, where there's an awful lot of knowledge there, and the knowledge is brilliant and has been developed, but it's not backed by a strategic government investment plan or government commitment. So it's all well and good producing a Just Transition Commission report. It's all well good producing, like the local community in Australia, producing a plan for the region. But really this is also, unfortunately, about money and resources. And there's an awful lot of good work that's been shown. Basically, there's I think it's called the innovative state, or the entrepreneurial state, that they have to get involved and they have to invest. And that was a big finding in our NESC report as well, the whole report, that there is high transferability, but the investment must be there. And Fife is an example of where the last coal plant shut down, but they have major offshore wind potential and wind projects being built. So this, again, going back to these kind of past transitions or past kind of betrayals or feelings of betrayal anyway. Scotland, again, is an example of that. I didn't realise this myself until I looked into it, but so Fife is an area off the coast in Scotland on the coast where they used to have coal mining and coal plants and so on, and they had to shut down when the UK itself was transitioning away from that kind of heavy industrial economy into more of a, in the 1980s, 1990s, into more of a kind of intelligence economy, service-based economy, and that led to shutdown of an awful lot of employment. While just at that time in the 1980s, when they were shutting down coal plants and coal mining, they found, and shipyards as well, so all kind of industrial manufacturing was kind of closing down across the UK. In Scotland, they found a huge amount of oil and gas off the coast. So the argument there from trade unions and from the SNP, the Scottish National Party, was that, well, why is Westminster or England taking this oil and gas from Scotland when we have this closure of all our businesses? If our industrial manufacturing is closing down, our coal mines are closing down because of Westminster, why aren't we benefiting from the oil and gas that's off the coast of Scotland? Why can't we transfer the jobs from coal mining into this new industry? Which was a legitimate argument. And again, they still had very high energy poverty as well. And their solution there was for more oil to kind of stop energy poverty rather than energy efficiency, but that's another thing. And today, the same dichotomy is happening where you're having the closure of the oil and gas industry. So those fields are closing down, the oil and gas, which is a privatized industry, always been privatized from the beginning of the Conservative government in the 80s. And while that North Sea oil and gas is closing down, you have this new offshore wind industry, which is brilliant and which is huge and has lots of great potential. And again, as Skills Development Scotland has shown, the skills are entirely transferable. People who work in the oil and gas industry can very easily work in the offshore wind industry. But that transfer is not happening. And the oil and gas industry said it themselves. They say, we know this can happen, we're happy to do it, but the industry is privatized again. There's no state involvement in it other than kind of grants or kind of this foreign direct investment kind of grant kind of approach. They don't have a share in these wind farms. They don't have a state kind of pension fund approach, which is what happened in Norway. The offshore wind is just being built by multinational companies and being flown in. The steel and the wind turbines themselves aren't being built in Scotland despite the skills that are there. They're being flown in from Indonesia at a much lower price. So this is kind of like another, it's just a repetition of the past issue with the oil and gas industry in the 80s for a lot of these communities. So it's again a very interesting scenario, and the Just Transition Commission was actually a great forum to open up those debates and get people which you'd think would be opposing. Like there's a group called the Just Transition Partnership, which is all the kind of very heavy oil and gas industry trade unions with Friends of the Earth and with kind of their version of Stop Climate Chaos. And they signed a Just Transition Partnership agreement, and they've been campaigning as a kind of very cohesive, very tightly knit group for the Just Transition Commission, which they achieved. And they've been campaigning for strong workers' rights and other issues as well with the BIFAB dispute. So BIFAB, sorry, is the kind of the area where they can build the wind turbines in Fife, and the multinational companies off the coast are saying that they can't build them there, that they can build them in Indonesia. Actually, the ESB now has a part share in the offshore wind project. So hopefully, when I worked with Alice Mary on the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action, we put forward a letter asking the ESB to engage with the trade unions and the Friends of the Earth group. So hopefully that will start. I'm actually quite proud of the ESB in many ways. So hopefully they'll take that positive just transition approach. Anyway, issues with the ESB as well, but great. So I'm just going to give a quick example of Solidarność. Now I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but Poland, just to kind of give a kind of more cultural or kind of human face to just transition. Poland is often kind of held up as kind of a coal, an enemy of climate action in Europe. It's down at the bottom of climate action in Europe, along with Ireland, all the time. Ireland was recently surpassed as the worst kind of country on climate action initiatives by Poland this year. Usually we're number one, that worst. But Poland kind of has this long history of prioritizing coal and coal-fired energy production. And often there's kind of this kind of language, especially from environmental groups as well, that they're baddies, that they're not looking after the planet, they're not looking after developing countries. However, if you now that is true, they should be taking more climate action, and of course there's millions of people in Poland that would want more climate action, but it's important to understand kind of the cultural context of why and where that unwillingness to engage on climate may be coming from. And when I looked into it, I actually found that so Solidarność, I'm sure you're aware of it, was kind of this kind of brilliant trade union movement about openness in Polish society under communism. They kind of were a major part of the Berlin Wall falling, and the fall of kind of like that very kind of cruel, often very repressive kind of communist bloc approach to work, approach to society, that kind of control of dissent. And Solidarność were this big example of freedom, and freedom from a workers' rights perspective under communism. And it brought together intellectuals, it brought together students, it brought together blue-collar workers, it brought together a huge swathe of society to campaign for a better world. And they brought about the fall of the communist bloc in a way. And there was a great kind of upswell of freedom and new ideas and new way of doing things. And they were John Paul II's favorite trade union, apparently. But what's often not spoken about was that when the Berlin Wall fell, there was a huge kind of rollout of kind of reform in society, but that reform led to privatization again, and it also led to a kind of big fall in trade union organizing. So I'm not quite sure the figure, but it's certainly stark, around maybe 80–70% drop in unionization rates, and a huge drop in pay and conditions as well, alongside that. And unfortunately, you did get kind of the rise of the oligarch and kind of people conserving control over areas that, while it was unfortunately repressive communist kind of control, it was in voice apparently, in rhetoric, that of the people. So they kind of, it's an interesting, that Solidarność kind of brought about this huge change, but then now I'm not Polish, so of course if there's anyone here that knows a bit more, I'd love to hear about in the Q&A. But their last kind of bastion of trade union membership was the energy industry. So you have this huge fall across Polish society, and a lot of kind of bits of bitterness and bits of anger that what had been proposed didn't actually turn out to be this wonderful, you know, workers' rights paradise that might have been possible. And the last bastion is the energy industry, which is coal. And it's just kind of, it's interesting because I suppose this cultural movement, which was so powerful and so wonderful and so interesting, and it's now kind of confined just to coal industry, and they've become this more, the kind of more aligned with kind of the right-wing government. They've kind of become more aligned with neoliberalism, and yet there is that kind of cultural history to it. So it's very understandable then from that perspective that Poland would have this kind of wedded connection to coal, just like I suppose Ireland and farming. The IFA doesn't represent all farmers. It hardly represents kind of small family farming. It may be concerned, you know, it could be considered one of the few trade unions that's actually interested in reducing its members, because, you know, that kind of large industrial scale farming owned by one farmer who wouldn't farm with his family, that kind of cultural, they still benefit from a cultural history of farming in Ireland. Even the word boerel comes from boerebo, the cowboy. So I think understanding that context and coming to it with a position of humility. So Ireland is now part of the EU platform for co-region. So we get expertise and knowledge from these kind of transition experts. And Robert Pollock from that group told me a very interesting kind of perspective. He said that it's about humility and understanding that these communities are not resources to be taken from. They are not kind of workers that we have to retrain or push in a certain way. They come from a long cultural history and heritage kind of understanding. And as environmentalists, or would-be environmentalists going in, you must understand that and have a kind of very humble, kind of slow approach, listening, constantly listening. And yeah, so I don't know if do I have much time there, Jane? Do you think?
I think probably should sort of come to an end, so we have a little bit of time left for Q&A.
Okay, great. So I'll leave these 11 lessons. So yeah, my theory is that there's a spectre haunting climate action, and it's a past lived experience of communities and workers. So what I would advise is that it's not kind of it's not like a tick the box kind of, oh, climate action and just transition just tagged along at the end kind of as a PR kind of thing. It's actually a whole approach, and it's about understanding, well, what is a society that we're going to? If we're taking climate action, what is the post-climate action world that we're going to? And just transition helps us to focus on that. So this is a phrase here from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone is entitled to a social, environmental order in which the rights and freedoms can be fully realized. So that's what Just Transition is about. And what I'm kind of working on next at the moment is tying Kate Raworth's donut economics approach to a human rights-based framework that also incorporates very strong socioeconomic rights. But yes, it's about where we're going. And the report by the National Economic and Social Council, I would advise reading it. The president himself, Michael D. Higgins, he actually endorsed it, which was very rare for a president to endorse kind of a quite kind of political economy kind of report. So yes, would love to hear your perspectives in the Q&A, and yeah, that's it.